very happy to have Michael Krimper here from New York. He had a legendary journey through the snow in Toronto. I'm Shep Steiner, Associate Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art at the School of Art and editor of the journal Mosaic. And thanks for joining us for Michael Krimper's lecture tonight. Michael is a theorist and translator and also a comparative literaturist. The lecture itself is part of a series of 8 events titled Suicides, Ecocides, as many of you know, Untangling Futurity from Out of the Worst. Mosaic began hosting these last year with visits by Dr. Michael Marder, Gary Sherbert, the French post-conceptual artist Sedana Fife, the music historian Alan Clayson, and later this week, Benito Cereno, which will be very good, I think, as well. These events are hosted on traditional territories. And here I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses and research spaces are located on original lands of the Anishinaabe, Ininawak, Anisinainawak, Dakota Ayat, Dene, and Inuit, and on the national homelands of the Red River Métis. UN recognizes that the treaties signed on these lands are a lifelong enduring relationship, and we are dedicated to upholding their spirit and intent. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors, which include Mosaic, the Office of the President, the Faculty of Graduate Studies, the School of Art, the Departments of Religion, Sociology, Political Science and History, and the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities. Thank you all. And so to our speaker, Michael Krimper will also lead a seminar tomorrow at 11 in 409 Tier. Please join us for this. And if you'd like the reading for that, you can talk to Kate or Carolyn that are here too. I think I've distributed it as well. Dr. Krimper teaches at New York University's Gallatin School of Individualized Study. First encountered his work on a tip from the philosopher Etienne Turpin, and Michael told me he just bumped into Etienne at ACLA in Montreal. And Etienne directed me to Michael's new translation of Walter Benjamin's notes on Baudelaire's Parisian tableau. And I was struck by the very erudite and precise preface to this, where he maps out connections to Georges Bataille, Benjamin, and the Frankfurt School's interest in investigating forms of governance at the ragged edges of democracy. Krimper likes to work across such intellectual topographies, and in face, I think, of the long decline of democratic institutions, which already Bataille and other Benjamin were faced with in the 1930s. Part of Krimper's specific interest in Benjamin's essay was focused in the use of the word désœuvrement. Close, you can correct me. Or idleness, which figures in the critic's work, Benjamin's work on the relationship between the flaneur and the crowd. He's currently, Michael Krimper is currently finishing up a manuscript on this topic now, which he describes as an anti-work aesthetics and politics with an insurgent potential. In this work, he works in the vicinity of the notion of the inoperative community, from what he's told me, I gather, that one also finds in Jean-Luc Nancy, Maurice Blanchot, and Giorgio Agamben. This is what he calls, quote, non-sovereign ways of being and doing in common, and this might help us contribute to the work of reconciliation with Indigenous communities that we must do. Dr. Krimper's lecture tonight is titled Literature Strike, Melville Bartleby Theory, and Benito Cereno. Please welcome Michael Krimper.
Great, thanks so much, Shep. Thank you, Kate. Thank you to everyone who made this possible. Thank you for being here on a snowy day. How's the microphone in this angle? Does it seem good enough?
Yeah, it might be overkill to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to read something that is a transition from this book project on anti-work aesthetics and politics in a new direction. And it has to do with Melville and two of Melville's short stories, Bartleby as well as Benito Cereno, which are back-to-back in a volume called The Piazza Tales. No piece of American fiction has received as much attention from theory as Herman Melville's short story, Bartleby, the Scrivener. For about a decade, started by Deleuze in 1989, everyone had their say. Jacques Derrida, Giorgio Gambin, T. Kuhn, Michael Hart, Antonio Negri, Jacques Rancière. Deleuze, for his part, had been drawing on earlier readings of Bartleby by Maurice Blanchot, who extensively wrote on the Scrivener's absolute refusal in the writing of The Disaster. What was so fascinating about Bartleby? Why did this novella provoke such a belated reception after its date of publication in 1853, at which point it flopped, as did the much bigger disappointment for Melville, Moby Dick? How did this dead letter, which never arrived at its destination of a large public readership, end up being revived in a later epic, which gave it something of an afterlife that has maybe now passed as much as the theory that reanimated it, and that too has been pronounced dead, fading into the wastebin of history? It's not only the death knell of Bartleby theory that has been sounded out, but its politics too. We're now quite distant from the wave of Bartleby theory, which would come to resonate with the demonstrators of Occupy Wall Street in 2011. Those occupiers, at first in New York and soon enough around the world, protested the neoliberal policies of austerity measures and bank bailouts undertaken by neoliberal regimes to restabilize the global economy during the Great Recession. Occupy itself was a permutation in a historical sequence of political upheavals oriented around the strategy of deoccupying zones of urban space. Proceeding from the Arab Spring and the movement of the plazas in 2010, its reverberations can be felt in other efforts to free enclosed spaces for common use and life. So I'm thinking of Zod, for example, as well as the pro-Palestinian university encampments in 2024. These events we often hear from the detractors of leftist political organization failed for various reasons. Their spontaneity never organized into an enduring form of political struggle. They did not bring any lasting change of social and economic justice, or the power vacuum they opened was filled by the reestablishment of yet another oppressive government. If Bartleby theory and politics has thereby run its course, then its exhausted potential might furnish the perspective from which we could critically assess the stakes of the work's resurgence and depletion. But nothing is so certain. Failure, after all, haunts Melville. The failure of his novels, literature, first of all, but also politics, especially regarding the task of abolition and its weight on the Union. The failure of absolute refusal is what Bartleby embraces, thinks, and lives up to the extreme point of dying. Many of us are familiar with the story, but I'll quickly rehearse it, bring it back to mind. The unnamed narrator, a lawyer who deals with rich men's bonds, mortgages, and property, hires Bartleby as a law copyist, hoping that his passive and calm demeanor will balance the unruly work rhythms of the other clerks. The plan backfires. Initially, Bartleby is industrious, working day and night like a copy machine. Then, one day, when asked to verify the accuracy of some copy, he answers, ever politely, "I would prefer not to." The boss is baffled, repeats himself, and receives the same response, "I would prefer not to." He falls silent, seemingly defied by the insubordination of his lowly clerk, but at the same time intrigued by the passive resistance of this bereft existence, hardly resembling anything ordinarily human. So he postpones what to do with Bartleby and becomes increasingly passive himself, seized by the enigma of the Scrivener's refusal without explanation or demand. Every effort the narrator lawyer makes to reason with Bartleby and bring him back to the law comes to naught. The power dynamic between employer and employee is subverted over and over again. At one of the narrator's deepest moments of doubt and uncertainty, he considers whether all the justice and all the reason is on the other side. Things escalate even more when he visits the law offices on a Sunday morning on the way to Trinity Church and encounters Bartleby, who is squatting the premises and refuses him entry. The narrator listens and is commanded by his own clerk, disarmed and unmanned. This is quite the passage. Now the utterly unsurmised appearance of Bartleby tenanting my law chambers on a Sunday morning with his cadaverously gentlemanly nonchalance, yet withal firm and self-possessed, had such a strange effect upon me that incontinently I slunk away from my own door and did as desired, but not without sundry twinges of impotent rebellion against the mild effrontery of this unaccountable Scrivener. Indeed, it was his wonderful mildness chiefly which not only disarmed me, but undemanded me, as it were. For I consider that one for the time is sort of unmanned when he tranquilly permits his hired clerk to dictate to him and order him away from his own premises. The term unmanned stems from maritime lexicon, designating the absence of the captain or the crew of a ship without which it cannot operate. If the lawyer is disarmed in the sense of losing the power of command over a subordinate, unmanned indicates a more general loss of sovereignty and being, the dispossession of the autonomous subject. In recurrent intervals, Bartleby interrupts or even renders inoperative the whole system of work, tying together the business of the law and property from which the authority of the lawyer is derived on Wall Street. After giving up work entirely, Bartleby becomes totally useless and unproductive in the workplace. But the narrator still wants to understand and help him, championing the Protestant American spirit of charity. He tries everything possible. What the narrator learns in doing so is that his speech presupposes that he will be obeyed. But Bartleby's negative preference assumes nothing, presupposes nothing. The unaccountable and unreachable Scrivener cannot be reasoned with, let alone saved. And once the narrator imagines his clerk will outlive him and by squatter's rights appropriate his property and wealth, he decides to cut all ties of responsibility and change offices. The new tenants call the police, and Bartleby is thrown in jail, known as the Tombs, for the strange crime of being a vagrant who refuses to budge. In prison, Bartleby stops eating as though on a hunger strike, and the narrator, who visits one last time, witnesses him wasting away on the verge of dying. Derrida, in The Gift of Death, calls this Bartleby's suicidal or sacrificial passion. Bartleby's death sentence, Derrida specifies, is a death given by the law by a society that doesn't even know why it acts the way it acts. So one of the major threads of Bartleby theory, running through this constellation of Bartleby theory, is the absolute negativity transmitted by the Scrivener's extreme passivity, refusal, and this kind of suicidal or sacrificial passion. And that's what I want to reconsider with you tonight. That extreme negativity, the absolute negativity, and what would make it either suicidal or sacrificial, in what way. And I want to stay attuned, really, to this problem of that connection between the suicidal, sacrificial, and refusal, or a politics of refusal. And what I want to do is read Bartleby alongside Benito Cereno, which is a story of slave revolt, which I will get to soon. So the question of refusal, sort of literary refusal, or refusal of literature, is quite complicated in Melville, and we'll have some time to unpack and to make recomplicated Melville. A little more on Bartleby theory first. So Deleuze depicts Bartleby's negative preference as a formula rather than an act of refusal. Its copious repetition exhibits a zone of indiscernibility in and through language. By severing the usage of propositional speech that says either yes or no, the formula topples the syntax of the English language. Whatever Bartleby would prefer not to do or be lies in suspense, or maybe he would just prefer not to. With each occurrence of the formula, Deleuze clarifies, there is a stupor surrounding Bartleby, as if one had heard the unspeakable or the unstoppable, and there's Bartleby's silence, as if he had said everything and exhausted language at the same time. Finally, the formula occasions depersonalizing effects in proportion to the growth of the nothingness of the will, that is, the inertia of pure patient passivity, elaborated by Blanchot. At scattered junctures, Blanchot traces the movement of pure writing in Bartleby as from an activity to a passivity. He notes how the Scrivener's ostensible refusal does not express a deliberate or voluntary decision of willpower, but tends to the absolute. The absolute, in turn, opens to failure. I want to read this passage with you in Blanchot. This is the core of refusal which Bartleby, the Scrivener's inexorable, I would prefer not to, expresses, an abstention which has never had to be decided upon, which precedes all decisions and was not so much a denial as more than that, an abdication. Bartleby gives up, not that he ever pronounces or clarifies this renunciation, ever saying anything. He gives up the authority to speak. This is abnegation understood as the abandonment of the self, a relinquishment of identity, refusal which does not cleave to refusal, but opens to failure, to the loss of thought, to the loss of being, and to thought. So Blanchot hereby marks the steps of Bartleby's refusal according to the negativity heard in the Latin prefix ab, meaning away, from off, or down. The writer's abstention of speech, by way of speech, precedes the capacity of decision-making and approaches the self-abnegation and objection of the impersonal. More specifically, it induces an experience of abdication, whereby sovereign selfhood is abandoned and let go. Bartleby dwells at the interstices between living and dying, being and nothing, language and silence, in the midst of the disaster. We have fallen out of being, Blanchot concludes, outside where, immobile, proceeding with a slow and even step, destroyed men come and go. Yet from this source of infinite patient passivity, the writer draws the non-power of absolute refusal, with which nothing can be done. This negativity subsequently cannot be maintained and set to work by Hegel's dialectical system. Instead, the self-effacing language punctuated by an unlabored negative, or what Blanchot often calls the neuter, consigns the work of the system to worklessness and unworking, to désavouement or inoperativity. Okay, a little bit more Bartleby theory with Agamben, and then we'll move on. So in the first volume of Homo Sacer, Agamben modifies Blanchot's technical usage of désavouement in the Italian as inoprosita, underscoring the potential that does not pass to the act, but retains its own potential not to. So this is potential that stays in potential. His aim is to dismantle the priority of actualization in Aristotle's metaphysics, and thus the ontological ground on the basis of which the political determination of sovereignty in the West is founded. Borrowing from Carl Schmitt and Michel Foucault, Agamben holds that modernity is structured by the biopolitical power of the sovereign state of exception, which mass produces the bare life of Homo sacer, who is the man who can be killed but not sacrificed, thereby included in the juridical order by virtue of their exclusion. It is Bartleby Agamben proposes, more than any other literary work or philosophical treatise, which exacerbates the poise of sovereignty, albeit without untying it. The strongest objection against the principle of sovereignty is contained in Melville Bartleby, the Scrivener, with his "I would prefer not to" resists every possibility of deciding between the potential and the potential not to. These remarks signal Agamben's turn from the argument laid out in his earlier essay, Bartleby or on Contingency, where he reads Melville through the lens of negative redemption. Following Deleuze's notion that Bartleby is a new Christ whose sacrifice withholds the radical democratic promise of America, liberated from the figure of the father, Agamben contends that the story redeems what was not. It saves, in other words, the unsaved as unsaved, restoring the actual to potential, like Benjamin's angel of history. Where Blanchot and Agamben converge, despite their key departures around inoperativity, is on the question of refusal, situated within the space of literature or writing. Bartleby is not merely a figure of refusal, it is the name of the literary work that refuses to work. Bartleby's strike, characterized by impersonal passivity, thus introduces an altogether different struggle for justice, namely literature's struggle, or as Blanchot puts it, the combat by literature for literature. The literature to which Bartleby belongs strikes against sovereign power, deposes and abdicates, and it keeps going on strike. Agamben, however, does not awaken all the ghosts of the past with his invocation of Benjamin's angel of history. There's a certain blind spot in Bartleby theory and politics. Agamben, Blanchot, and many thinkers of this text neglect or too quickly abstract from the literary and historical context of Melville's writing in the antebellum period. Melville wrote Bartleby in 1853, just a few years prior to the eruption of the Civil War in the United States. It bears traces of his deepening, albeit vexed, commitment to abolition as slavery threatened to expand into the West, spurred on by the appropriation of the territories resulting from the Mexican-American War and the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. Melville's writing addresses slavery from numerous, often contradictory perspectives, given voice by characters or shaped by irresolvable antagonisms. At times, his philosophical fiction reiterates a metaphysical view of freedom that does not distinguish racial slavery from other forms of universal human bondage. Who ain't a slave? Famously asked Ishmael in the opening chapter of Moby Dick. Ishmael's question, though, remains unanswered. Melville knew quite well that the freedom of whiteness, the white man in particular, structurally depended on the unfreedom of blackness. In Marty, Babylanja, who's the philosopher, notes how white supremacy establishes and constitutes the unsovereign condition of the black slave. Unmanned, says Babylanja, they know not what they are. Marty's narrator puts forward an acerbic takedown of racial slavery as a sin that tears apart the bonds of social life, bonds that could be retied solely with the reparative time of friendship and philanthropy. However, Melville's skepticism grows in The Confidence Man, where religious optimism falters and the mediating liberal claims of abolitionist humanism thwart its own possibility. One of the disguises of the con man admits, this is from Confidence Man, if by abolitionist you mean a zealot, I am none, but if you mean a man who being a man feels for all men, slaves included, and by any lawful act, opposed to nobody's interest and therefore rousing nobody's enmity, would willingly abolish suffering, supposing it, in its degree, to exist from mankind, irrespective of color. If the qualifying clauses of that passage are a bit confusing, it's sort of the point. The white abolish offers the con of compassion without actually risking anything, without putting themselves at stake, without putting the people at stake, without putting the nation at stake in the name of justice, assuming any kind of ethical responsibility for the enslaved black population. Now they're worried that modernity's sovereign ideals of progress and liberty, represented by the settler colonial expansion of the U.S. Republic under the banner of manifest destiny, are inextricably tangled with decline and bondage. And we encounter precisely this bind between the American conquest of liberty and the experiment of unfreedom, the expansion of unfreedom, in the volume of the Piazza Tales where Bartleby was republished. The writer's failed work stoppage is followed by the failed slave revolt led by Babo and Benito Cereno. The fates of their strikes are determined in the state's capture of life and its exercise, if brutal, if not lethal, violence upon them. Those who assert their freedom, however unknown or uncertain, has been structurally denied. In Bartleby, not only does the fragmentary breakdown of the narrative imply Melville's fraught support of abolition, there are also cryptic signs in the text. The crushed body of Bartleby is called a bit of wreck in the mid-Atlantic, and it resounds with the disaster of the Middle Passage. It conveys an affinity between Bartleby's sacrificial passion and the demise of the enslaved, who risked their lives in unmanning the ship or who jumped overboard and committed suicide. Furthermore, the Scrivener's negative preference coincides with the way Frederick Douglass formulates his unrelenting drive to escape slavery. This is Douglass. For my part, I should prefer death to hopeless bondage. We should nevertheless note that the analogy is a stretch. The voluntary servitude of office work that civilly destroys Bartleby is not the same as the coercion of slave labor. The Bartleby is subjugated by the bureaucratic management of the office, and by confinement in prison, he does not endure the regime of terror presiding over the enclosure of the plantation and the hold of the ship. If Bartleby's mechanical industriousness of reproduction in the workplace wears him down past the nub, he is not subject to the slaver's right to abuse, torture, and kill. The dehumanization, exploitation, and alienation generated by the class system of capitalism is not the same as the social death instituted by chattel slavery. But could one say that Bartleby, the ghost that haunts Wall Street, is likewise haunted by the transatlantic slave trade, the traces of which are buried, forgotten, disavowed, silenced, or simply unnoticed by the major thinkers of Bartleby Theory? I believe not mentioned once anywhere. Is Bartleby therefore haunted by the other specter of Wall Street, the system of racial slavery that played a fundamental role in generating the prosperity of modern imperial Europe in addition to the United States? And after all, the words Wall Street should remind us that the synecdoche for global financial capitalism once designated the site of the largest slave trade in the market of New York. All right, moving on to Benito Cereno. Melville writes Benito Cereno from the perspective of Amasa Delano, the captain of a seal hunting ship in Massachusetts called the Bachelor's Delight. The narrative frames Delano's limited observations and understanding of the event as it unfolds, based on his memoirs of its actual historical occurrence in 1805. At the outset, Delano encounters a Spanish ship that appears in distress near the uninhabited island of Santa Maria off the coast of Chile. When he makes contacts with the ship, called the Saint Dominic, invoking the island where the Haitian Revolution erupted, he meets the Spanish captain, Don Benito Cereno, who recounts the troubles they had endured. The San Dominic suffered damage from extreme weather in the sea. They lost the owner, Don Alexandro Aranda, and a number of the crew, as well as some of the West African cargo being transported to the slave markets in South America. After several months, supplies dwindled and they desperately needed aid. What Delano does not yet know, is that this whole account is fabricated. The West Africans on board had carried out a violent insurrection, killed the owner and some crew members, and ordered Benito Cereno to return them either to the closest free black nation or the shores of Senegal. So now they were just pretending to still be slaves, and the white captain and crew to still be masters. This seether is being orchestrated by the leader of the mutiny, Babo, who plays the duplicitous role of Don Benito's manservant and confidant. Captain Delano gradually noticed strange things. Don Benito's apparent indifference, Babo's unnerving intimacy with the white commander, and the somewhat unfettered movement of the slaves on board. Delano, though, reads the whole scene wrong, mistaking Don Benito's nervous condition for European snobbery and a disorder of both the crew and the slaves as caused by his negligence. That is until hours later when the Spanish captain leaps onto the Bachelor's Delight and cries out for military support, Babo chasing him with a dagger, and so in a sudden leap of the imagination, everything is revealed to Delano, or so he thinks. What Delano had been unable to imagine is that the West Africans on the San Dominic could have been pretending to be enslaved, that they had been performing their allotted social roles to deceive him and escape undetected, perhaps with some assistance. He had been unable to imagine that the black slaves could have staged an elaborate scheme in which they held the white masters hostage after killing the owner and taking over the vessel. If the West Africans could act out the social norms and expectations of black submission to white mastery, Spanish and American alike, then the racialized determination of the master-slave paradigm would be denaturalized. For the formerly enslaved would thereby demonstrate rational mastery over themselves and others, bind the iterations of racialized subjectivity from multiple cultural and linguistic perspectives, and assert their right to self-determination and freedom against oppression. It would exhibit the unjust and illegitimate capture of their lives by the political machine of white supremacy founded on the structural exclusion of blackness. The fixed opposition between whiteness as freedom, blackness as unfreedom would collapse. Melville's subversion of the master-slave paradigm crystallizes in a notably tense scene where Babo wraps a Spanish flag around Don Benito's neck and cheerfully sits him down for a shave with a straight razor. Babo proceeds to scratch the surface of the face and the text with the restrained threat of violence, which keeps making Don Benito shudder and twitch up to the point that his face is nicked and some blood is drawn. So Babo is testing out what freedoms he can get away with, or what he can invent under the conditions in which freedom must appear like submission and stay unrecognized. And it is remarkable that Delano glimpses the inverted position of executioner and victim, but quickly sets aside the thought, unable to acknowledge the toppling of white imperial domination as a real possibility. I'll just leave that one up so I can speed up a bit. While attentively observing the scene, Delano can only confirm the natural affection of the enslaved for their master. The American paternalism meant to justify the moral ground of racial slavery exposes its sheer blindness and unreason. Babo's threat of violence has a certain force due to the collective uprising and mutiny the formerly enslaved had already carried out on the ship. The West African men and women refused to stay in chains and opted to actively struggle against their white captors. Melville thus writes the master-slave struggle at odds with the Hegelian dialectic from the standpoint of the slave's worklessness, taken to Bartleby's idleness, which is to say from the unproductive region of captivity rather than the productive circuit of labor power. The slave who revolts from the hold of the ship does not triumph over the master by virtue of the labor of the negative, and tearing with death steadily brings about the self-production and recognition of the slave as the new master, nor does he exercise the violence against the enslaver, as in Melville's illustration, necessarily recover the slave's lost humanity. On the contrary, the refusal of bondage stems from an excess of insubordination. It does not remove them from the extreme passivity of affliction, but keeps them suspended in the hold. They have not yet fully liberated themselves, but remain dispossessed and disinherited, still emerging from the uncertain sight of capture and the unsovereign sight of capture, with no guarantee of success in the future. In this way, the slave's insurgency evokes the instant of sacrifice, in which life is put at risk before death, breaking the chains of submission. This is getting back to the sacrificial and suicidal passion. So if we turn to Ashun Mbembe on necropolitics, he raises the question whether the enslaved, colonized, or the subjugated can take power over his or her own death under the most extreme circumstances of freedom by way of self-sacrifice or suicide. It is difficult to conceive how freedom, he says, can be represented as agency when someone is compelled to choose death over either impression or enslavement, when someone is pushed to put themselves at stake in the name of what they want to live for. He touches on several examples of this nexus between death and freedom, including the occurrence where runaway black slaves caught in flight from the plantation would sometimes commit mass suicide rather than return to captivity. You can think of Toni Morrison's Beloved and Margaret Garner as one of the examples here. There's many. In Mbembe's view, the absolute expenditure of self-sacrifice can never achieve the recognition and prestige determining the telos of the master-slave dialectic. For someone who sacrifices their own life has no awareness of either what they have done or the witness's ostensible testimony thereof. And yet these acts of sacrifice, he suggests, while citing Paul Villeroy, signal a fugitive sense of freedom, and that sense is of release from bondage and tear. A release from bondage and tear. The suicidal or sacrificial passion is a recurring motif in abolitionist narratives and memoirs of fugitive slaves. When Douglas, whom Melville read very carefully, is urged by forces outside of his control to run away from bondage, prefiguring his physical combat with the slave breaker Covey, he puts his life at stake before death. Yet, this is Douglas, it was a doubtful liberty at most and certain death if we failed. And so Douglas states, I should prefer death to hopeless bondage. Another way of saying I would prefer not to. It is the instant of sacrifice in the sense of risk-taking as an absolute expenditure which already conveys the fugitive sense of freedom detached from its potential fruition or actualization. So that instant of sacrifice is already the risk-taking. Whether or not the risk-taking leads to one's own death. Douglas' preference for death then marks the conjuncture between the sacrificial passion of Bartleby's formula and the slave revolt on the San Dominic. However, whereas the passive resistance and deoccupation sustained by Bartleby's refusal is what unmans his boss, the active resistance of the slave revolt led by Blabo's refusal has recourse to lethal violence and the subsequent threat thereof in order to coerce the former white master. Both end in failure. For a moment, though, the master-slave struggle is destabilized or at a standstill. This moment takes on the discontinuous, irregular duration of an interval in which the fugitives are no longer enslaved and not yet free. The ship becomes an interstitial site of passage and transport at the limit between bondage and freedom, where those who rebel are neither sovereign nor unsovereign, while justice and law hangs in the balance. Literature, too, carries this movement outward and away, in suspense. That suspense lasts as long as the theater, staged by the fugitives, evades recognition by the witness, Captain Delano, who retains the capacity to reinstall the sovereign state of exception shored up by white supremacy. And once Delano grasps what has come to pass, he sees the slaves as violent pirates in open revolt. Despite representing the liberal ideals of Protestant American humanism and supporting the cause of abolition, Delano decides to restore the command of the San Dominic to its Spanish Catholic captain. His own command of violence, furthermore, is legitimated by the sovereign authority of international laws, codes, and norms governing the relationship and obligations between the ships of white American and European nation states. For the sake of the imperial order, and while expecting adequate economic compensation, Delano and his crew slaughter dozens of the West Africans who fought for their right to freedom. And they recapture Babo, who's tried in a Peruvian court months later, sentenced to death. Where am I on time now? I'm running out a bit. And let me introduce the last part on follow your leader, just to get that out there. And follow your leader, or follow the leader, is a formulation and a formule in Benito Cereno. And it's inverted. And it's inverted as a form of kind of display or image. And I'll read one passage for you here. And we read it from the excerpts of the deposition that's included in Benito Cereno. So Benito Cereno is asking Babo for what has happened to the body of Aranda Don Alexandro, who is the captain of the ship. And this is what they find out. Babo showed him a skeleton which had been substituted for the shipper's proper figurehead, the image of Christopher Colon, the discoverer of the New World. The Negro asked him whose skeleton that was, and whether from its whiteness he should not think it a white's. That upon covering his face, the Negro Babo, coming close, said words to this effect: "Keep faith with the blacks from here to Senegal, or you shall in spirit, as now in body, follow your leader, to the prow." And Babo ritualizes this procedure with the succession of each Spaniard on the ship, and he warns them every day that they should, soul and body, go the way of Don Alexandro if he sees them speak or plot anything against the West Africans. The command follow your leader is situated within the configuration of slave revolt that reverberates in the waves of the Haitian Revolution, would no longer demand total submission and obedience to the white authority of the captain or owner of the ship, nor to the sovereign international order of racial slavery in the modern era of settler colonialism initiated by Columbus and the Spanish Empire he represents. If another enslaver and the other enslaver afterward follows their leader into death, the system of racial slavery could suddenly disappear and be abolished. Hence, Don Benito's death can be registered as a political suicide, induced by his own sacrificial passion before the illegitimate, unjustified, and deauthorized institution of racial slavery. It is from this perspective that we can read the occurrence of the formula in more recent social and political contexts of anti-fascist or anti-totalitarian protests. This is a widely popularized stencil from the 1990s. I'm referring to the command follow your leader, an iconic stencil of Hitler killing himself, started apparently by Antifa protesters in Toronto. The meaning of the command, as much as Don Benito's demise, is nonetheless ambiguous. And this is why Schmidt, the German jurist who voluntarily committed to Hitler, the National Socialist Party in 1933, cites Melville's Benito Cereno more than any other literary text in his writing, occasionally signing letters from the Spanish captain's name. And this is what Schmidt says about Benito Cereno. I am the last conscious representative of the Jus Publicum Europaeum, its last teacher and researcher in an existential sense, and I experience its end in the same way that Benito Cereno experienced the journey of the pirate ship. In this way, Schmidt tries to explain the allegiances to Hitler and the Nazi Party as coercion, just as Don Benito was forced to pretend normal relations and comply with the demands of Babbo and his fellow pirates. Ultimately, he seeks redemption for a life ostensibly held captive by the Nazi regime and thereafter by Allied forces. The character of Benito Cereno hereby takes on mythic proportions for him, but Schmidt cannot conceive that the sovereign state of exception underlying the system of racial slavery is unjust, nor can he imagine that Babbo and the West Africans on board the San Dominic could declare the real state of emergency in the struggle to depose their oppressors and strike against those who, according to abolitionist discourse of the time, were the real pirates. I'm going to come to my concluding remarks here. Our approach to Bartleby theory furnishes yet another perspective from which we can read the command to follow your leader. Within the literary space of Benito Cereno, the imperative is stripped of the force of lethal violence that consists in taking a life, in either sacrificing the self or the other. Follow your leader means instead refuse the principles of domination and extermination underlying racial capitalism, submit to the exorbitant demand to abolish racial slavery, if not imperial colonialism as a whole, run the risk of undergoing the experience of self-abnegation and depersonalization in the face of death, over which no one has any command. In doing so, you would come to embrace the inappropriable finitude and materiality of shared common existence. From the fallen zone out of being, where destroyed men like Bartleby or Babbo come and go, is drawn and affirmed the non-sovereign force of uprising that challenges every given line of command and renders destitute the juridical order without inaugurating a new one. The literary sense of the command, follow your leader, asserts no authority other than the experience of abdication. It elicits contesting all authority, including its own, and thus leaderless. Even though the Black uprising of Benito Cereno mobilizes the violence of active resistance, the work, I would suggest, evokes the nonviolent force of passive resistance, animating the combat of literature for and by literature. The fictive representation of sacrifice, we should recall from George Bataille, is a comedy in which no one is actually killed. The literary sacrifice for Bataille brings about the annihilation of the object, and more precisely, the annihilation of what determines language and life as objecthood, controlled and measured by the principles of use value, exchange, and productivity. What is annihilated is therefore the subordination of life to work in servitude, structured by subject-object relations of mastery, acquisition, and ownership. Babbo, who is vehemently dehumanized, is not a thing. The court might have delivered him to a voiceless end and burned his body to ashes. But for many days, the head, that hive of subtlety, fixed on a pole in the plaza, met unabashed the gaze of the whites. The head that can speak no more continues from beyond the grave to refuse and command the white gaze. Babbo is explosive, subtle, vibrant, whirling, communicative, matter and energy, life and death, the infinite excess of insurgency open to failure, the loss of being and thought. What this sacrificial writing therefore annihilates is the condemnation of Black life to what Fanon calls the inert zone of non-being, and more generally, the abolition of work that would transform all of life. What it communicates is the common diffusion of finite material existence at the interstices of the outside. It is possible that Melville knew, or at least sensed across the chasm of the Middle Passage, the name Babbo in the Hausa language evokes the absolute negativity of refusal, or means no. And the broken transmission of Benito Cereno, swerving from its destination, like the dead letter of Bartleby, keeps sending out in the wake of the failed slave revolt on the San Dominic. It does not stop staging the art of refusal, its lines of flight outward, which withhold the chance of living and dying otherwise, or of living on, surviving. Literature's strike thus partakes in the struggle of a non-sovereign mode of life and death, shared in common without possession. And so, 3 months after being dismissed from court, Benito Cereno, in the final lines of Melville's novella, did indeed follow his leader. Thank you all.
I know Michael had a long trip from New York this morning, but I know he'd be very enthused to answer your questions today. Invigorated after that trip. Please.
All you. Hey.
Are there any distinctions you've made between the more kind of passive sacrifice of Bartleby versus the more active role of Buffalo? Is there something to be said there between kind of passivity versus activity?
Yes, absolutely. So I think what's interesting with that question of sacrifice, and you can trace a line really from Bataille into Mbembe, and certainly it's at stake in a lot of this abolitionist literature. It's at stake in Fanon too. So there's many different fields. And what Mbembe is saying is that that moment of risk-taking, that instant of taking the risk of putting the life at stake before death, is that instant of sacrifice. So it's an instant in which you are living in such a way that you might die for it, or you might be killed for it, or you might end up killing yourself too. You might end up dying in the name of what you want to live for. And so this lets Mbembe consider the possibility that there's some kind of freedom, there's some kind of strange freedom within acts of committing suicide under extreme conditions of unfreedom. And he calls this, with Gilroy, a release from bondage and from terror. Bataille is thinking about it within kind of a different line of sociological theory, and then sacrifice. But it is something that he's wondering whether that can take place in art, whether that can take place in fiction. And in that case, it would be a sort of sacrifice or instant of sacrifice that doesn't actually kill or doesn't take a life, but would still put life at risk in some kind of way. So there's, I guess, the part of the problem, or part of what I'm trying to trace out, is that whole range of the more active to the more passive senses of sacrifice here. But also, if we're talking about literature, if we're talking about art, there's always some kind of passive animation of it, because no life is taken. And this is why Bataille says that sacrifice is a comedy. In its fictive realm as a representation. So it's different than Bartleby's is what I agree with that. Yeah. Hey.
Thank you so much. That was so great. I've always been very suspicious of the unnamed narrator because he's in complete control of the whole story, and we don't even know if he's telling us the truth. And I've always felt that the story kind of like raises the specter of resistance, but then just to extinguish it at the end, you know, it's very frustrating and sad.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's so interesting that Bartleby's been taken up as this kind of figure of resistance by many, you know, political activist movements, by theorists over the years. But I feel like in the end, he's like you were talking about him in the negative, like he's a photographic negative of the narrator. Like his resistance is only activated by the narrator's like insistence that he keeps working, right? And in that way, like I don't know if we actually learn anything about Bartleby. Just like in Heart of Darkness, we don't learn anything about the Congolese. We only learn everything about Britain and British colonialism, which is useful, but it's like a weird sort of mirror reflection of itself, like it's caught in a narcissistic kind of thing, you know? So, yeah, I don't know, it's interesting to put it in conversation with Benito Cereno too, right? Because I think it changes our reading of Bartleby in that way, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, like at all, but that's kind of my constant frustration with the narrator, and poor Bartleby, who just dies like incarcerated and alone and hungry.
Yes, on his hunger strike, if it is a hunger strike.
Yeah.
Reading Bartleby is a lot of fun, and it's very frustrating and intriguing for those of you who haven't picked it up yet. I do kind of wonder of like people who are younger than me, what they think about Bartleby and whether it still touches them in the same way. And oftentimes, at least my students are upset with it, but not in the way that I'm upset with it, because they want to put him back to work. You know, I mean, it's the problem. It's the problem that Melville is playing with in the frame. We have only the narrator's observations and perspective, besides the epilogue, which is the dead letter epilogue. And there's that dialectical or somewhat dialectical antagonism between the two, the play between the two of the employer and the employee. And so I think there's two aspects or two moves here that are helping me still think about Bartleby Theory. And one is to read it with Benito Cereno, and they are back to back in the Piazza Tales, which makes it even more surprising that this is rarely done. And the other is to kind of link back the Bartleby as a figure of refusal or work refusal to literature, to the work of literature as also refusing to work, which is probably this frustration that we're sharing here. And this might have something to do with the dead letter too, that I didn't talk about very much. But Melville was someone writing in the 1850s who wanted a huge readership. He wanted to be popular. He wanted people to read him and care about him and think about him. He thought that he had things to say that should enjoy this kind of wide public readership. But everything he did was a flop. I mean, Moby Dick sold some copies, but it was a huge disappointment. It wasn't even close to being a contender of the great American novel. And so in the 1850s, as what the Civil War is approaching, he's just becoming increasingly skeptical, cynical, pessimistic about literature and what literature can do, or art, and the failure of literature and art, while politics is also failing. So I think that, my other move to get out of this is to make that link more explicit between this figure of Bartleby and then the work of literature, or literature in general, as Bartleby. I didn't have a lot of plane rides today, so it's like the voice is getting rough, but thank you for
Thank you very much. I found this very interesting. I'm a historian, I'm a specialist in literature, so I don't know the details of that. But I found certainly many of the concepts we were explaining very fascinating. Especially the story about Cereno and the stable world, passivity, who is in power and who is not. The reflection of the connection between literature, art, but also with history. And it reminded me a lot, probably about a book you probably read, Peter Linegover and Marcus Rediker, The Many-Headed Hydra, which is a whole discussion of the rise of the Atlantic world and how it is described, by those who are building it as a kind of Herculean effort, and those who are opposing it as the Many-Headed Hydra, right? And the Hydra were pirates, sailors, religious dissidents, fifth monarchies, ranters, diggers, who are moved in the Atlantic Ocean, right? How this movement, deeply historical, is reflected in literature, in religious appeals, in art, So when we're describing all this context, for that, it reminds me a lot about these contentious forms of resistance from bottom up, They are writing from the British Marxist perspective of bottom-up history, social history, but in a very interesting way, because they are kind of following many of these schools' ideas about going beyond traditional Marxism by embracing, for example, religion, how religion became, the tool, the device of the time to express opposition, which otherwise would be called as class, right? So, in any case, I found really interesting your description of this and the connections that can be drawn to precisely how history unfolded in ways we usually don't see, don't think about.
Yeah, I mean, Melville didn't write a lot of historical fiction, and Benito Cereno is a paradigmatic example of that. There's an excellent book by Greg Grandin on Benito Cereno, and for me, when I started to become more immersed in this story alongside Bartleby, I went through Greg Grandin's book. It's probably almost 20 years old now. The freedom of necessity, and he goes a lot into the details of the differences between the fiction and the memoirs and the historical event to try to unravel some of what had happened in the archive. Benito Cereno does not follow his leader 3 months after the court case. Benito Cereno lives out much longer than that. And so there's this question of why is Melville returning to a historical event from 1805, 50 years later in 1855? Why is he returning to that event in this period of time? And it's also the question I've been asking too about this belated reception of Bartleby Theory. Almost 150 years later, all of these French philosophers, not only French, of course, just like the shorthand French, which is too much of an abbreviation, return to Bartleby. And perhaps if we do that alongside Benito Cereno, it would speak to us differently now and what following your leader might be. And it is quite bizarre that through some kind of loophole, some kind of reverberation feedback loop, that then there's a stencil that was widely popularized, Follow Your Leader, that has to do with kind of anti-fascist representations. So I guess I'm thinking of this, of the problem of method, and also as one that is within Melville's own fiction too.
Maybe another question?
Okay. So yes, thanks again. I thought that's very, very striking. Didn't realize I was going to punt on that. But, just the link there, and actually one of the images I was particularly struck was that the best regulated mind is not always free, right? That image and it did get me thinking about this question of like who's in control of those images, right? And that sort of regulation. And so that got me thinking about the juxtaposition. I think that you're at least drawing our attention to, both these texts draw attention to, a kind of legal discourse that does something, right? Has some sort of effect that then Bartleby refuses to enact. But then those depositions in Benito Cereno, so they're apparently doing something where I think you're suggesting the text itself, like Through the Tie, is like resisting actually doing something or giving the impression of doing something but not. And yet those legal depositions are having an effect, right? They can ultimately take a life, right, or lead to that. So I was just wondering about because Melville is so interested in different levels of discourse and how they interact with each other, as we can see when we did.
Right.
I was curious to hear if you've been thinking a little bit about that. If literature is striking, is it sort of in opposition at one level to this kind of legal discourse that is also preoccupying these texts?
Right. Yeah, that's nice. Thank you. The way I had been approaching literature strike is through Benjamin and the general strike. So this pertains to Benjamin saying that the general strike is a certain example of nonviolence or nonviolent force, that could depose the juridical order and the law without necessarily installing a new one. So it has that element of suspension that I'm now reading back into literature that I already see there and want to show. And so, but the general strike, as far as is it legal? Is there legislation for it? So in this case, it's something that can that is legislated, that can take place within a system and yet used against that system, just to say things very quickly here. And I think that doubling or that working against work or anti-work is what I'm paying attention to within that strand of literature. And it is something that counters or undermines the law and the discourse of the law, but yet might use the discourse of the law in order to render inoperative or counter and challenge at the same time.
Any other questions? We ended on a high note there. Maybe we can go to our buffet and continue conversation there.
Sounds great.
Just like to thank Dr. Michael Krimper for coming tonight and his